Fantastic. Let me introduce Peter Block then. We're excited to have him here. He's the Executive Vice President of Colliers Chicago and an Executive VP who joined them to lead and develop their retail investment practice group. And he does a lot of work in the single tenant, triple net lease transfer area space and working with franchisees in the sales leaseback area. He's chairman of their practice in that area, and he spent nearly a decade before this at Cushman & Wakefield, as well as Insignia CBRE, the CB Richard Ellis, which is something you'll see on Jim's resume as well. And he's a past president of NACOR International and Cornet International, and a current member of the International Council of Shopping Centers, and very active in the Restaurant Finance and Development Conference. Interestingly, he has a hobby of cooking, which I know a lot of people would probably love to find out more about. So if you have cooking questions, you can send them to him, and we'll try to address those at the very end. I can't vouch for whether or not you should put milk into the curry dish or not. You know, that's way beyond my pay grade. And then we've got Jim Hockman here. Used to practice out here in the suburbs and now is down in the Loop, making the big commute downtown, works with Shane Banks and is a partner there where he practices in the real estate practice group. Represents a lot of real estate types of brokerage firms, landlords, tenants, commercial real estate investors, assists in all phases of commercial and residential real estate. So really knows his stuff related to real estate. And when we were talking within our section council of people we could bring in as speakers, Jim jumped to the head of a lot of people's minds, and we said, yeah, let's bring him in. He was a senior VP and senior counsel to the CBRE for 22 years and represented them in all real estate service lines, and was general counsel to a real estate development firm specializing in condo conversions, and as branch counsel for a national title insurer. Does a lot of legislation related to commercial real estate brokers, has drafted statutes in several states on this issue of portability legislation for commercial real estate brokers, and helped develop the Illinois Commercial Real Estate Broker Lien Act, which has been adopted by several other states. And he's a faculty member for the Society of Industrial and Office Realtors, has taught a course in John Marshall in the LLM for real estate law. And in addition to that, he served our country as a commander in the United States Naval Reserve. And his final assignment was as Special Assistant Counsel to the U.S. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Forces. I could probably keep going on, but you can read the rest on his bio, which is in here. And now I'll turn it over to you, gentlemen, to tell us a little bit about the effects of COVID-19 on the real estate market and take real estate related questions. My understanding, people, is if you have a question at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says Q&A. Please put your questions in there and we will take them along the way. And as long as it's not disrupting the panel too much, we'll go ahead and take the questions along the way. Okay? Take it off, Peter.
All right, so I'm kicking it off, Marcus. Thank you for the introduction, and please do ask the questions. It obviously makes it more interesting for all of us to hit the points that are most relevant to you all. I would be happy if you guys wanted to spend an hour on food, but I guess you probably wouldn't get credit for that, so we'll stick to real estate. So with the topic you see on the main page, we have been, from the moment COVID hit, we've been collecting data and taking surveys to understand how it was affecting all of the businesses, and that goes from whether you were a tenant, whether you were a landlord, or whether you were a lender. So as we begin to flip the slide, we're going to share some data points with you and give you an idea of what's been happening from essentially the beginning of April when everything started to close down, and that was really late March, and bringing it to today and what's happening. So the first slide that we're looking at is the question you can see is, how has COVID affected the real estate markets? The insight is, as you look at the top two charts, in April, the effects that I believe we measured are much more about how did people feel at the time, as opposed to any concrete information in terms of what had been happening, because the businesses had all just started to be being affected and then just started to close down. And said differently, that's also when we all started to be quarantined, and therefore there was no one to go into the businesses. By the end of April, the contrast with the beginning of April is at least it experienced for the month what our new reality was, and obviously we all know the phrase the new normal. That's where I think if you try to dissect these charts, where we saw more, there's more spread between the different factors, because we started to see how it was really affecting us. And whereas on April 7th, I think everybody was really concerned, and that was just concern about the unknown. If you fast forward now to June 1st, we see what I'm going to call now the true normal. As you see, half of all respondents said that their businesses had been impacted for the last 2 months, but there is very little scatterization, right? It's either very impacted or somewhat impacted. So we all knew now that this was real, and this was affecting basically everyone. Anecdotally, I'm sure you'll know that we experienced the reality, and I'm going to say from our work, right? Because we all were working from home, and the effects that I think we have felt were much more about our personal lives, right, than our work lives, and how that all changed. And if you're a lot like me, one of the only trips out of the house you made was to the grocery store for the necessities. You didn't do the things that you would typically do, and go to restaurants and do the things that we generally do. I see somebody saying the charts are too small. I'm not sure what we can do about that. I don't know, Laura, if on your end there's any way to make those bigger.
I don't think there is, other than just enlarging the Zoom if you have a larger monitor. Like if you're on your phone or something, no, I don't think they'll be able to be enlarged.
Okay. All right. So if you go to the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, one thing. Barb did email the materials out, and so you could open it in from the materials link that she sent, and then you could zoom it into whatever you want as an audience. Thank you.
Okay. So the themes in the data will tend to repeat themselves today as we go through these slides. You'll see the differences, the perspectives, and how it's affecting people. So first, we're looking specifically at tenants and what tenants have been doing. And I would say that the data shows what the high level of anxiety everybody had at the beginning of April. And that anxiety moderated as the month went on. And again, I think I'm repeating an earlier comment there, is people now started to understand what the real effects on them individually were, and how it was affecting the businesses. The other impact was, as the month went on, you actually started to see PPP, which was, I now heard was your last topic, but PPP started to get in place, and people started, and again, that's been spotty, started to get some money. What I've heard most from tenants and landlords is that the users that stopped paying rent stopped by paying a portion of the rent, not all of the rent right away. And clearly that's also, I think, an effect of revenue. Were they getting any revenue, or were they getting no revenue? As we look and see how it moved when we look at the June 1st data, I think it's interesting, as the 2 months has gone by, more people are actually asking for rent relief than had originally asked. Which makes sense, right? Because if anybody had any money in reserve, they might have been able to weather the first month. But as it has continued, they've clearly had more challenges with a lack of revenue, and therefore had had less ways to pay rent, and were affecting the landlords more greatly.
It's also possible that the PPP was applied for March or April and May rent, and now tenants that didn't turn over the PPP funds are asking for rent relief. So it could have a kind of a delay, the delayed PPP effect. Again, this is anecdotal, Peter's got a survey, but it all depends on which parties responded. I'll talk a little bit about some of my clients and how they saw things. But there is no definitive sweeping survey to tell you everything that's going on in the industry. You know that.
That is
Peter,
correct.
excuse me.
And I would argue too, that I think the information here is very insightful. Our audience, our respondents aren't in the thousands. They're in the hundreds or lower, so that, you know, it's a smaller subset, but our practice, as Mark was explaining, it's both in the investment arena and in the leasing arena. So we're seeing, and Jim's, we'll talk more anecdotally about what we're seeing from our clients, both from a tenant standpoint, a landlord standpoint. As we go now to the next slide, getting very, very following from the last slide, but being very specific now, is have the tenants actually stop paying rent, and if they stop paying rent, what is it that they stopped paying? So again, as you see on April 7th, I would argue that the more strata that you see was from a pure lack of knowing what was coming. So people that chose to stop paying all of their rent were basically trying to say, I need to preserve what I have so that I can see that I can stay in business. And when you move to later in the month, what you saw now was the vast majority of tenants were basically asking for relief on rent, and they were still paying the operating expenses of the building. Now, I will say anecdotally, we have heard from both my landlord clients and tenant clients, there are certainly some that have not been able to pay rent, but generally this was the solution that most people tried to arrive at so that everybody could still manage their businesses as best they could. I think what's interesting now is if you look at the bottom chart and you look at the respondents, it really splits 50-50 in terms of people that have, and this is really a comparison over time of how many more people are asking for rent relief. So you would expect more people to ask because there's more stress, but I think it's interesting that half of the people were not asking. And again, anecdotally, the businesses that were most affected are the pretty obvious are the restaurants. The ones that are most or least affected would have included, you know, the grocery stores, the dollar stores, even the auto stores and the pharmacies. Those were the, you know, our phrase, those were the essential businesses. All right, if we go to the next slide. Here we go. Now turning our perspective to looking at the landlords, and the reality of the tenants not paying rent is as it flows downstream, it created the stress on the landlords, which then ultimately created some stress, and we'll talk about it, on lenders and on the loans on the property. Not collecting rent truly impacted their ability to make their mortgage payments. So that as we see these April numbers, if we look at April 7th, that, you know, the landlords had not yet really experienced lack of rent payment, or it had just started. So again, I think it's interesting that that first chart is sort of, I'm going to say, more bottom weighted in terms of the modest impact that they felt. And then as we move up to April 27th, you're looking at fully 50% of them, 50% of landlords were being impacted. And I would suggest to you that the difference between the ones that are impacted and the ones that are not impacted, clearly the not impacted ones were, their primary tendencies were the essential businesses that we were just referencing. And now if we fast forward to the June numbers, with the reopenings in the economy, I think the significant concerns have moderated. We'll see if they come back because everybody's already talking about a second wave. But I think it's interesting that, again, that you have roughly 50% of the respondents saying there is some general concern with their ability to make their mortgage payments, but there's almost 40% that aren't worried. So I think that's, you know, again, the experience of what we've been going through is really 2.5 months long, but it's real, but it didn't have as much time, I think, to affect what's going on. So if we continue on to the next slide. So then we asked, this was a one-time question that we asked based on what we've been asking. And we asked landlords how many of them had stopped making mortgage payments. And as you can see, it's 11% stopped making mortgage payments. And I got to say, I was surprised to see this because again, they could only, they might only be 2 months into this experience. And I think there's, 2 reasons. Obviously, one is if they literally were thin and didn't have rent to pay the mortgage, that was a challenge. The other, real challenge would have been if they were super highly leveraged. So if it's a strip center and they were getting some rent, not all rent, and that affected their ability to make their mortgage payments. All right, so if we go to the next slide. So now we're looking at the same issue, but looking at it from how did the mortgage lender work with the borrower to help them through this period we're in. So we don't have the April 7th data because they didn't have we needed some timeline to get to see how this was being affected. So on April 27th, you'll see that 50% of all loans, if you asked for a loan modification, they were giving you an interest-only alternative. And I think it should be noted, and I know, Jim, we chatted a bit about this yesterday, is that whenever we had, whether it was a tenant or a landlord ask, call us up, and that was a frequent call, what should we do? One of the primary things we recommended was openness and complete transparency. So if you were a landlord, we were recommending that you show the lender every request that you're getting so they can understand that you are making a request based on need, not based on just what's going on in the market. So the requests that were granted by the lenders typically have been set up for 60 or 90 days. And I think everybody's pretty much been doing that as a reset. And I know that's happening also on the tenant side, that people are making much longer requests, but the person that's being affected is saying, let's take this in chunks as we see how this opens up and what will, and determine how to help you in the short term, and we'll see if it's a long-term problem.
And I think it's interesting if we pause for just a second, if I may, Peter. We all know this is a period of time when you couldn't evict a tenant for non-payment of rent today if you wanted to. The courts are closed. Likewise, a lender might be able to file a foreclosure proceeding electronically. Don't know if you could serve, and it certainly wouldn't be heard. So the lack of a judicial solution, so to speak, has had, I think, a very, very fortunate response, and that is landlords, tenants, and lenders have to talk to each other. It's not a matter of who's waving the biggest stick. I'll come back and talk about some interesting litigation later, but at least as we're looking at this in March and April and May with courts closed and early June, people are working things out because they have to. There's no judge to bring the gavel down. Sorry, Peter, I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, we said, please, I encourage you to weigh in. So then in June, what I think is really interesting, again, so roughly, again, half the audience is actually taken advantage of, and I mean that in a fair way, taken advantage of the need to get some modification from their lender. I think the interesting counterpoint is that actually almost half of the borrowers did not get any relief. And I would say that's largely, that fact is largely institutional in nature, because at the institutional level of ownership, you have people that are either publicly traded, have much deeper pockets, and have much more significant loans. So they have the ability to weather this better than a smaller landlord. And you also have the, I also think this one was one of the ones that I think partially was affected by a smaller subset of respondents, because anecdotally, there are a lot more, almost every lender's, I mean, almost every borrower has been affected, all right, with the exception at the institutional level. All right, if we go to the next slide now. So now again, as we continue this, I've given the perspective of the tenant, perspective of the landlord, the impact of how the lenders were working. And now we're just a couple slides that are going to give us insight into how people are feeling about the economy. And this, to me, will be dictating as we move forward how the people are, how we all begin to react. So what I think is interesting is when you look at the April 7th and we asked if we thought we were going to enter a recession, and I believe this audience knows that a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. But in April, we had 3/4 of the respondent already say that we're going to end up in a recession. And again, we're only a few weeks into the shutdown. When we got to the end of April, we still had, I guess technically we had even a higher level of respondents say that they thought there would be a recession. And again, I think at that point, we were truly knee deep in the stay-at-home orders. And again, so what I think is interesting now when we look at the June data is that number is pulled back, and half of the respondents said, yes, I think we're going to have a recession. And again, I think that what's interesting, I think, about data is so much of this is subjective. So what you're seeing in that June information is a number of us started going back to work. A number of businesses started to open, even if partially, so that there was no question that there is a change in our feelings, a change in our habits, a change in just the attitude we had about what we were doing. That I know for myself, we came back to work June 1st. So I'm in my office now, and that dynamic has changed even for me, going out for lunch or something. So I think this slide is encouraging for all of us if it continues. If we then go to the next slide, we asked the question of, and this was trying to get some level of understanding on how they thought real estate values would be impacted by what was going on. And here's one slide where, regardless of the time when the question was asked, from April to June, it's relatively consistent with where it's at. Everyone has thought that, yes, the real estate values are going to be hit, and you can see the most prevalent expectation is that it's only going down somewhere between 5 and 10%. So let's hope that it's moderated to that level. And if we go now to the last slide, asked again a couple of very simple questions, and I think the questions are very similar actually. Did you notice any impact on commercial real estate transactions? And have you seen a decrease in deal flow? And as you can see in both cases, that more than 90% respondents. And I can tell you anecdotally, I was on a internal company call today with the Midwest brokers at Colliers, and to a T, everybody was talking about their transaction volume, and this is on the leasing side, being down anywhere from 75 to 90%. There clearly is, based on what's happening, nobody's looking for new space, and the transactions that people were working on are all related to just the timing of leases that were expiring more than anything, unless there was just an overhang deal that had not completed in the month of March. So with that said, thank you for listening, and we will pass this on to Jim.
Thank you, Peter. Very, very helpful. So what have we got here? We've got an overriding theme as far as I'm concerned. We, both landlords and tenants, are in this together, and all parties are vulnerable. In talking with Peter about our presentation and how to pull it together, and even a kind of a dry run yesterday, got me thinking last night. I think a lot of our perceptions about what's going on within real estate are impacted by what are we doing? Are we home? Are we working? Are we busy? Are we not so busy? Are we pausing at 5 o'clock or thereabouts to hear the president present on the pandemic? Are we tuning in to see if there are governors or mayors that have something to say, that are talking about state-specific problems? I was, at the beginning of this, I began to get on my exercise bike, and as I watched President Trump and his team, politics coming out, please don't be offended, my fellow DuPage residents, But as I got angrier and angrier with our administration and how they were handling it, I pedaled harder and harder and farther and farther. So it enhanced my workout, but at the same time, it was adding to concern and anger and uncertainty. I reached out to my clients and they reached out to me and, hey, what's going on? What are we doing here? What are you hearing? And to the rescue, brokers to the rescue, property managers to the rescue. What can we do to help our clients? And to a person, they talked about communication and they talked about helping each other. Next slide, please. So rent relief comes to mind because tenants, particularly retail tenants or restaurant tenants, I got no income, I've got to have some relief. Well, we've been through this before. We've talked about rent relief. We've all represented landlords and tenants in one-off situations. Some of us remember back to pretty scary markets, 2007, 8, 9. I can remember the 89 to 91 period at CBRE. We just bought the company from Sears. We all had lots of CB stock and we were looking at a horrifying market. So we've dealt with the issue of rent relief before. How do you get it? What are you looking for? Tenant says, you got to give me relief on rent. Stop. I got no money. I can't pay you rent. Well, says landlord, you got to help me. I'll give you something, but I got to get something. So instead of rent abatement, let's think about rent deferral. Let's think about, I'll cut you some slack to the extent I can. Let's not forget mortgage lenders out there. But let's take care of the property. Let's take care of your investment in your space. So let's talk about continuing to help the landlord pay taxes and CAM. And let's talk about base rent to the extent that I need to help you, landlord helping tenant, and to the extent that my lender can give me some slack. And to the extent that you can get some federal stimulus money, let's be transparent here. And tenants, if you're getting government money, fess up. Use that money. Make sure it's a grant and not a loan. And let's keep the ship afloat together. So as all of you lawyers know, the more issues there are in a negotiation, the better chance you have of getting to yes. So if you have different variables, it's not just, I don't want to pay rent anymore. Now, if we talk about partial abatement, partial deferral, other ways to cut the cake, maybe you got a chance of finding a solution for all parties. Next slide, please.
Wait, Jim, if I can just chime
Please.
in, because we had talked about yesterday and you highlighted, and I think this is really relevant, is that the landlords, when the requests were made by the tenants, were very particular to go back and look and open up many other lease clauses for discussion. So just not if there was rent deferral, adding time back onto the lease, but literally looking at termination options that existed. It could affect the option periods, and then specifically requested they would send out forms and say you had to fill out the forms that would talk about PPP as you applied for PPP, and made them open their books and records so that they could really understand that they were in need of the dollar and not just asking for it.
Yep. And the entire lease is perhaps not up for renegotiation. And I apologize, that's my landline. I got no control here. I'm merely a tenant in my wife's house. Sorry, the point is, if there are terms to be renegotiated, let's get rid of that option to renew that the landlord hated to give, or let's adjust rent down the road. Brand new game. All right, what are the parties' alternatives? You heard me mention it before. Courts are still closed. Evictions won't happen quickly. The economy is tentative. As we heard Peter say, new tenants are a very, very rare breed. New leasing right now, slowing, I won't say to a trickle, but it's certainly down a little bit. So landlord and tenant, you are stuck with each other. Let's see if we can make a go of it. Next slide, landlords feeling the pressure. Foreclosures won't happen immediately or quickly, but they could happen. So let's take a minute and think about the dialogue that ought to occur between lender and borrower. How's it going? Well, it's not going well. I'm in communication with my tenants. I'm coaxing whatever I can get from them. I've got the long-term view, Mr. Lender. I want to keep these tenants here. I want to keep them alive. I want this building to be successful. I want you to understand that I'm doing everything I can to preserve the asset, which is your collateral, but it's our investment. It's my investment. So yes, lender, we're in it together as well. And this is where, gosh, I hope the borrowers have relationships with loan officers. Because if it's just somebody servicing a loan, it could be a little bit cold.
And
Next slide.
Jim, we've got a question which I think ties into your next slide right here. The question is, do you have example agreements between tenants and landlords dealing with abatement or otherwise? And I think that may be point B on this slide, and you can address that question.
You know, I do have some agreements, and I can work with you on that. I didn't include them in the presentation, and I'll tell you why. It was fairness to a client who approached me very early on. In fact, late March, they were ahead of the curve and said, we represent a lot of family investors, mom and pops that own shopping centers. How can we help them most? There will be rent relief. How can we set up a program so that we can exchange information and modify leases as the parties might agree? So I did design for them addenda or modifications to lease, which would restate rent temporarily or perhaps change certain terms in the lease. I'll bet everyone out there could draft such a form very, very easily. The point was, my client wanted to put it in the hands of their owners so that they could move forward and strike a deal early on and not leave it to uncertainty. So that's what we did with forms for lease modification. But if I could go back to point A for just a second, I suggested to my client, and my client agreed, let's get some questionnaires out there. Tenants, share with us your problem. What are your resources? What can you do? And are you getting PPP? Because if you can open the kimono, so to speak, and share with us your problems and give us the transparency, now I've got something to say down the line when I talk to my lender. So we were facilitating communication, we were facilitating lease modification, and then what else can property managers do during these troubled times? Well, other property managers told me they jump right into the signage business. If you've got restaurants who are now doing takeout, or you've got pickup, or you've got different situations on how to manage customers or office tenants coming to the property. Point is, the property managers were jumping in saying, how can we help everyone? You know, I've got new respect for the property management profession. I cut my teeth at CB in the 80s and 90s, and you all can remember that the big dog in the brokerage firms were the brokers. They were making the big bucks, the big commissions. The property managers were doing the things that were important, but they weren't making the big bucks. They were keeping the lights on. Well, crunch time, it's not the new lease that's going to save anyone. And it's not that a property is going to be sold immediately and or recapitalized. It's what happens at the brick and mortar level to make sure that the tenants can survive, to make sure that the owners can survive, to make sure that the lenders can appreciate what everyone is doing. My point D on this one, sometimes I get a little poetic, but you know, it's important to listen. And I think property managers spending time with their clients, just listening to their woes, I think probably won some points as far as cementing client relationships. Next slide goes to talk about the forms. Abating rent or partially abating rent or conditionally abating rent. Yeah, I'll abate rent, says landlord. We'll cut your base rent by X%, so long as you pay the reduced or abated rent. And if you don't pay that, then I have the right to recover all the rent, including the abated rent. So what we're doing is we're creating leverage. We're saying, look, fellas, we're not going to hurt each other. Okay, let's make a deal we can live with, but you've got to own up to it because there will be consequences. I think point D is important. Require application of federal stimulus funds. Tenants, if you're getting money from the Fed, don't just put it in your pocket. Don't make opportunistic purchases of inventory. If it's there to keep the doors open and pay the rent, pay the rent. Now, what happens is when the stimulus funds end, I think tenants will be back and will want abated rent further down the road. But at least we're getting through these initial few months. And finally, my point E, extend the lease. Extend the lease term so that the tenant can perhaps repay the abated rent. And at the same time, now the landlord has some security because I've got a longer lease. Again, it's a matter of creativity. It's a matter of communication. You know, I talk about the property manager being a good listener. I think a landlord has to be a good listener to the tenant's tale of woe.
And Jim, we have another question up. If you want to click over to the questions, what is your current experience with CMBS lenders? Local lenders are very understanding. Even big banks have been told to work something out by the feds. Not so with CMBS. Wells Fargo is as they were in 2008, as are the special servicers. Do you have a different experience? And if so, how have you done it? And please explain what a CMBS lender is.
Well, CMBS is the big guys, and these are mortgage-backed securities. And I don't have any experience in CMBS loans being enforced or foreclosure threatened at this point. So I haven't seen the big dogs barking in that fashion. I will tell you, and I'm gonna sanitize this, but I had as difficult a commercial real estate closing as I can remember in recent years that closed in the midst of the pandemic, in fact, in late March. And this was an upside down situation. My client, the seller, the borrower got in trouble. Loan accruing interest, more and more interest, late charges, et cetera. Local municipality insisting on certain pre-closing repairs or post-closing repairs secured by an escrow. The hole was deeper and deeper and deeper. And I went to the mortgage lender. Dame Fortune smiled. The general counsel for this mortgage lender happened to be someone that I knew. He was the general counsel at Oak Brook Bank, which was CB's landlord in the Oak Brook office in the days of yore. First name Bill, I'll leave it at that. Bill, we've got a problem here. I can't tell you you're going to get 100 cents on the dollar. You've got other collateral. Let's talk about what you need in order to close this sale and get this loan moved to different collateral. You don't want to own this building. My people don't want to own this building. Two guys who know each other. Two guys who are, I'll be candid, 70 years old and have been in the industry for a while, recognizing there's a certain amount of trust and a certain amount of practicality. And when faced with the grim reality of if this deal fails, consequences are far worse for everyone, I had the lender's attention, and a local lender, they weren't happy. They didn't give away money, but it was deferred. And we found a way to work it out. And I will be, on behalf of my clients, forever grateful to this lender and the lender being receptive to an extraordinary situation. Now, were I a banker, and I don't think I have the, I don't think that's my personality, but were I a banker, I would certainly be treating my borrowers and my depositors like gold. That's who we've got right now. The same way landlords have existing tenants, and they're not going to have new ones in the foreseeable future. Let's make the most of these relationships and these assets. So I hope that question was at least somewhat responsive. That answer was responsive to the question. I don't think I gave you everything you hoped for. Maybe there's a comeback to that. Maybe there's a CMBS story out there that we could all learn from.
Well, let me chime in. I would just say on the CMBS side, Jim, your story was great because what it tells is the problem with CMBS loans is when you need to find somebody to try to resolve an issue, it's very difficult to find them. So that's what I would tell you currently the experiences that I've heard. And again, that type of loan, very difficult, very limited flexibility to begin with because the loans are all sold off, right? So what people can do to help is not a lot to begin with, besides the fact you can't find them to talk to.
You work your way through the organization to the company that's called the special servicer. This is being taped. I may eat these words. There may be some things that are not so special about special servicers. It may be their own bureaucracy, or it may be different attitudes. Because we were at the local level with a community bank, and again, fortunately, someone I knew, someone with whom I had a past relationship, we were able to get this thing done. You know, landlords who know their tenants have an edge here. They're walking around, they're talking to people, how's business? If it's a shopping center, they're walking around the office building. Who's coming to work? Are people working remotely? What can I do to make this easier for you? We're building a bridge here. My own firm, this might be an interesting anecdote for you. My own firm is looking for new office space. Frankly, we're in the midst of negotiations for a new lease in our existing building. Great relationship between landlord and my firm. You got to put that one on pause. I'll pick some numbers. If we hope to take 20,000 feet, are we going to take 20,000 feet in the next iteration of our lease? Or are we thinking of a smaller area because more of our employees have learned to work from home and may continue to work from home? Or they may come to work 2 days a week and work remotely 3 days a week. All of these things are up in the air. The point is, we'd like to stay in this particular building. We'd like to find a space that makes sense for our particular operation going forward. In order to make that deal, and by the way, we were on third lease draft, so we were close to making that bigger deal. If you've got communication, maybe that 20,000 foot deal becomes a 15 or a 12,000 square footer, but you're still there and you're still talking. And the landlord has saved someone from leaving the building, and the tenant has found a way to continue to exist in a building, in a location that they want. Tales from the front. We've talked about that. Landlords are certainly making concessions. Tenants are fighting to stay in place. Political comment here. We're talking about money. We're talking about business. We all watch TV. My heart breaks when I see what has happened to retailers as a result of the violence in the streets and the looting, which may or may not have political ramifications. But tenants fighting to stay in place, fingers crossed that insurance covers some of these disasters. God knows how it will shake out. Tenants using PPP to pay rent, we've talked about it. Retail tenants seeking and accepting help. Pause. One of my brokers sent me a complaint yesterday that was making its way around. Victoria's Secret has filed a lawsuit in New York City claiming that its lease is void due to frustration of purpose. That lack of retail, lack of support, pandemic, et cetera, the lease is void. So while we talk about retail tenants seeking and accepting help, perhaps Victoria's Secret and its parent company have gone that route with no success. They're now filing suit saying this lease is over. Another interesting piece of litigation, maybe you folks have read about it, the law firm of Jenner and Block is claiming that they are denied the full use of the space and therefore should be entitled to or should pay only partial rent. And they're now putting this question before the courts. Yes, the case is e-filed. I don't know when it will be e-heard or actually heard, but these are obviously situations where the well-meaning negotiations have only gone so far and have not sought any resolution. Office tenants do seem to carry on. Retail suffering more than office in my experience. And then I just happened to have one of my multifamily investor clients on the phone, and he said, I wasn't sure what to expect. March rent came in, people paid their rent. I paused, I projected a downturn in April. April rent, 100% paid. Couple of stragglers, April rent was paid. He said, well, this can't go on forever. I'm budgeting for a real kick in the knee in May. And in May, the rent came in. And here we are in early June, and he's still saying things are very good. So your housing costs seem to be number one on the list. He says, in fact, my business is great because there are all kinds of people who are invested in office and retail who want to get into multifamily housing. So maybe this is a bright market spot in real estate investment, shifting to a different property type. My last slide, if I may. I'm just repeating what Peter and I have said. Maybe it's the common fears and the uncertainty that have bound landlords and tenant together in the fight for survival. It's a realistic approach. We all want to come through this. Nobody can do it alone. Smart landlords want to keep existing tenants. Existing tenants want to maintain a landlord relationship. And again, depending upon the type of mortgage lender, CMBS, maybe not so much, but your local lenders are reaching out and finding a way to preserve relationships. Folks, you've been very kind to listen. I don't know if I've steamrolled through questions or if other thoughts and comments come up, but we're happy to reserve our last few minutes for Q&A or for Peter's favorite recipes, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, Peter and James, I have a question. This is Marcus again. I have a client. They've made it through, but they're struggling at 60%. They still have the cash, so to speak, to pay the landlord, but they would like some rent relief so that they could have some extra money and a little bit more profitability towards the end of the year than bare bones scraping even kind of a thing. How would you, and then looking at your presentation here, you're talking about transparency and using the PPP funds, which they will, for the rent and so forth. But if they're paying the landlord, everyone else is paying the landlord, landlord's profitability percentage would technically stay the same as last year, whereas tenants' profitability is barely scraping by. How would you approach that sort of conversation in order to get a concession from the landlord in that situation?
Why don't I take it first?
Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, because I think we'll get slightly different angles in how we look at it. I think the way I would initially approach it is I would say, again, transparency matters, and the conversation has to be about the problem that we're talking about today is short term. The problem you're highlighting is long term. And I think that the tenant has to say that I need the help so that I can continue to be a tenant in good standing with you for the rest of my lease. So that's a different argument, and you're taking it away from just the short-term problems we're having. And again, by sharing what you described, if you can show the historical year-over-year reduction in the level of income coming in and profitability, that argument has, I think, more legitimacy to it.
Peter, I think that's a great answer. I was coming about it differently, and I like the way you view it. Marcus, I was and I am not as sympathetic to your tenant right now as Peter might be. I may be overreacting, but Marcus, your tenant sounds a bit opportunistic in that, well, things are tough and there are rent concessions or rent abatement deals out there. I don't really need one right now, but I'd sure like one if I could get it. So I'm going to
Well,
ask.
I need one to avoid breaking even at the end of the year, or maybe at a loss that I can sustain, as opposed to having a little bit more profitability.
Well, then your client makes his case with open books. Again, I teach a lease course for SIOR, and I emphasize for the brokers that what you are working on here, as you lawyers who are listening know, is you are orchestrating and facilitating a multi-year relationship. It's not just a battle over 10, 20, 30, 50 pages of lease language. It is a business relationship that will endure over a lease term and perhaps on to the next lease term and the next lease term. If your client, Marcus, can make a compelling case for survival, enhanced or made possible by some sort of rent abatement, okay. Were I representing the landlord, I would say, open the kimono, show me the books, and if in fact you need it, we'll work it out. But we're going to extend this lease, and the rent abatement that I'm going to give you now, I'm going to want to pick up down the road. Maybe we'll increase the rent in years 3, 4, 5 to give you a break now. So it becomes a zero-sum game, and in essence, what I'm doing is deferring so that you've got the books and the year-end figures that you need.
Mm-hmm.
That may be the way I go back to it. It's a very interesting question. I'm sorry I'm not sympathetic. It just didn't strike me that was a compelling request for rent abatement.
When I was an attorney representing a big property management company, I took a similar stance.
Well, you know, one of our more visible local landlords happens to be industrial property, and he's a fellow I've known since he got in the industry 35 years ago, was quoted, and I was almost embarrassed to read it. He said, let me tell you about rent. Rent's due on the 1st. It's delinquent on the 2nd day of the month. And I thought, gee, I hope that attitude gets modified and he mellows somehow in these difficult times. He's been very successful. He controls a lot of property. He's got a lot of important industrial leases, but I hope that at some point he cherishes these tenant relationships. Other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions, but I really value your time, your expertise, Jim and Peter. It's been great hearing these tales from the trenches, where the industry is going, what we're seeing out there.